everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I hope everything's working because I've set up a new OBS for this. So if it's not working, if you can't hear me, if whatever's not happening, please let me know in the chat. Hi to Krabby and to Sam. I see you there in the chat. Hi to anybody who joins up later if they do. This is what you get for taking a 3-month break from YouTube. You get not noticed anymore, but that's fine because I don't care about that. Today I want to talk about efficacy and honesty in science because it is oh, thanks Krabby. It's a brand new microphone. I bought this one because it was cheap and it's got a mute button on it. Oh, thank you. Yeah, efficacy and honesty in science. Now, I realize that honesty is probably an aspect of being ethical in science. So perhaps the title for the video is a little bit obtuse, but one of the reasons why this really frustrates me is the number of times that and Twitter's going to come up here because I argue with fools on Twitter all the time. And I will call people fools because if you're going to argue from a position of science and not actually understand the science, then you're being a fool. You must know that I'm pretty sure some people don't realize that they don't know the science, but some of them do know that they don't know what they're talking about. And at that point, you are just being a fool. So, when I'm arguing with these people, they will often bring up studies that are 20 years old or even 10 years old that have been refuted since they were published. And this is not necessarily a problem of efficacy in the people who wrote the papers originally. In the fact that they might be totally honest in their working in their studies that they did, in the statistical analysis of those studies, etc. And it's just that new evidence has come in later that has that's shown them to be inaccurate. Because that's usually the best term to use in science. That something was inaccurate. Not that they were necessarily wrong. It's just inaccurate. But there are certainly cases where people are wrong, where people deliberately misrepresent the facts, where they deliberately go out of their way to prove something that they want proven instead of what actually is the case. And this is a problem in science. It's not an enormous problem, but it's definitely a problem. Now, we talk about science being self-correcting. That peer review means that people come back, they look at these papers, they go, can we repeat the experiment? If we do repeat it, do we get the same results? However, in a lot of fields in science, especially when you're talking about fields that are quite small, where there isn't a lot of interest by a lot of scientists to actually look into these fields, often published papers will sit there in the eye of the scientific community for years before anybody else does similar research and proves that those papers are wrong. And this is where efficacy turns out to be a major issue. An example I'll give, and it's only because I recently argued it with somebody on Twitter, is Kenneth Zucker. Now, Zucker is he's still alive, but he was dethroned from his position of power. Zucker is a clinical psychologist, and he specialized in gender therapies. He did a study on persistent rates in young children and teenagers based on his work in gender therapy from the 1980s up until the 2000s, where he used 146 of his subjects, the kids he worked with, which just to highlight, we're talking about a 25-year period of working with these kids, and he only found 146 of them that he could actually write about. And given that he was also using from his department, so his colleagues who were who had data on kids too, he was using that as well. And he came up with the myth that, and I will call it a myth because it really, really is a myth, that the desistance rate in young kids was about 86%. This stood for about 10 years. He published his preliminary findings in 2010, but the final paper only came out in 2014. But that concept of talking about desistant rates in trans kids being 86% stood from there until 2020, when newer papers were being released and when people had actually gone back over his research topics, his research, and found flaws in it. Because the newer papers weren't showing desistance rates anywhere near that high. The Swedish papers showed a desistance rate of about 42%, which is half of what he did. But even more so, an Australian paper which stated 1,200 children from age ranges of about 5 to 17, and is still in the whole study is still in progress because they're still doing follow-ups and everything because it's over a prolonged period of time. It was started in 2017. This particular study was cited in a court case in Australia where it showed that the desistance rate in Australia was 4%. Well, that's an order of magnitude less than what Zucker's results is. So what happened? Zucker had a preconceived notion. He liked doing what we would call conversion therapy on young trans kids and gay kids to stop them being the gay and stop them being the trans, because he thought that normal was better. His terms, normal was better. So he had a preconceived notion of what he wanted to do. So he cherry-picked his subjects. He mostly picked gender non-conforming kids, not kids who identified as trans, for his study. And therefore his results were incredibly skewed in the direction he wanted it to do, to make sure that his department got their funding and could continue doing his conversion therapy. This is pretty much unethical. In more ways than one. One way, he was abusing the kids because he's doing conversion therapy on them. And secondly, he's produced a study that influences other clinical psychologists and people working in the field that is inaccurate because he's deliberately set out with a concept that he wants, a result that he wants, and found the subjects to get there. There are other examples of this. The Rogde supposed late onset gender dysphoria study done by, and I cannot remember her name, from Canada. Basically, she wanted to show that there was this thing called late onset gender dysphoria. She decided this was a thing, and then decided to do a study to prove this thing. That's not necessarily a problem. The problem came about how she got her information for her study. She put out a notice on a whole heap of parental support websites that were for parents who did not approve of their children being trans, to find out what the parents, not the kids, what the parents thought about their kids with coming forward to them as being trans. And of course, these parents would say, oh, we had no idea that our child was trans, because they weren't looking for it, because they didn't know what was going on. So the efficacy of her experiment was this: she went for the crowd that she knew were going to give her the answers that she wanted, so that she would get the answers she wanted. And again, unethical, because you're not having any structure of control groups, you're not having any structure of openness in your working. Now, of course, she was discovered straight away on peer review, and she was torn down for it. She had to actually take her paper down and resubmit it with basically stating that this was just her opinion from the groups of people that she talked to. But these papers get published. people latch onto them and they go, oh, this must be true. Um, that's not how we look at papers in science. When we're looking at people's work that they've done in science, the papers that they work on, we have to look at the whole gamut of it. We read through the paper. We look at how they've chosen their subjects or their data that they're going to base their statistical analysis on. We look at the results from that, and we then decide whether was this a fair way for them to do that? Could this be done any better? And if we're in agreement, we might say, hey, look, this is a really interesting paper. This needs to be looked into more, and we wait for it to be looked into more. We don't just go on the back of one scientific paper and say, hey, this must be true, because science can be wrong for a very large number of reasons. And it might just be that you've misinterpreted your data. It can be that there were errors in the data that were accidentally come in. A good example of that was the neutrinos that were faster than the speed of light, which turned out to be an electrical fault within the timing system used to time the passage of these neutrinos between these two locations. The electrical fault was the reason why the neutrinos appeared to be faster than the speed of light, not that the neutrinos are faster than the speed of light. And when the paper was published about these faster than light neutrinos, it listed the things that they did check for and the things they didn't check for, and other scientists picked up that there were things that they didn't check for that they should have checked for, and when they were checked for, it was shown that the finding was wrong, which is actually what the people who published the paper thought would be the actual case, because when you have something that flies in the face of what we know in science, of well-held, established theories, which have years and years of evidence that back them up, then there's possibly something wrong with your paper. Not always. There might be something new that crops up, because we have had something new crop up quite frequently in science, but not always. And that's the thing. If it seems outrageous, it probably is. So claiming that we found something that moves faster than the speed of light, that is a known particle that we already know its properties, is unlikely. So there has to be something somewhere else in there. Very true, Krabby. It would be lovely if people didn't allow their personal beliefs to skew their results. Unfortunately, this happens always in science. We have preconceived ideas. A hypothesis is a preconceived idea. And it's something that we look at the data of something that's happening and we go, hey, this could be the situation. And from that moment on, we're trying to build experiments that will prove our idea, or to statistically within a certain ratio show that our idea has merit, is probably a better way to say it. We don't prove things in science. We show to within a certain reasonable amount of doubt that something is accurate. Proof is hard when you always have to have that ability for something to be disproved. If you can't disprove something, then basically you're taking something as belief instead of actual scientific facts. There are facts within science, like there are facts within maths. There are absolute proofs in some things. For example, maths. You can have an absolute proof in maths. You can have a proof in maths that is the very first paper written on it, and the first case will be another mathematician looking at it and go, yeah, the math checks out, your proof is correct, so your thesis here is exactly accurate. Your paper is right, because we can know that because there are set rules in how maths works and how these things are calculated. But in the physical world, things are a little bit more random than that. So when we're dealing with the science of nature or physics, quantum mechanics, anything like that, there's so much inherent probability in what we're dealing with and variance that all we can do is the things that are best closest to. So we have this efficacy of honesty in science, and I see it as a big problem, because when you have a preconceived idea, and you have to have a preconceived idea to have something you want to study, it is very hard to detach yourself from that preconceived idea and not try to engineer the result that you want. And that's a subconscious thing, not even a conscious thing. When you're doing it conscious, well, when you're doing it subconsciously, it's hard to know that that's what's happening. When you're cherry picking results from a subconscious effort, that you might go, oh, hang on, this is an outlier. Because generally speaking, when we're figuring out the statistical probabilities, we drop the outliers from both ends. So if you decide where your cutoff point is for outliers, and it helps your final result when maybe those outliers were significant, then in a sense you're cherry picking your data. And this can be a subconscious thing. It's not necessarily a conscious thing where we have decided that we're going to bring this, just have this data and it's all going to be as it is. It's psychologically we are looking at our data and going, oh yeah, this suits, this fits. It must, what I'm thinking must be real. And then we close in on where the data is. And this is an acknowledged problem in science, in that we, as humans, our human nature means that we will look for the things that back up the ideas that we have. And it is definitely a problem. It's why you get people who can be so cult-like in ideas about how things are, because they've looked for the support for the ideas that they have, for the things that they feel are real. And, it's a form of confirmation bias, and scientists are not immune to that confirmation bias. And it is a problem in science, a recognized one. However, generally speaking, we try to work above that. We try to stay and keep as many of the outliers in it as we can, so that we can make sure that our data sets are as accurate as possible. And we also publish data sets now in science, as well as, so the data sets that are published include the outliers, even if our statistical analysis doesn't, which means when somebody goes and peer reviews that scientific paper, they can go back and look at the data and say, hey, look, you excluded these things that you probably shouldn't have, because our little study on this that checked up on you said that these are actually a bit more common than you thought they were. So therefore, perhaps your paper is a little bit wrong and you're a bit out on that. And this is part of the peer review system, and it should work. Where it doesn't work is where you're talking about things that are fringe or uncommon. It's why psychological studies into gender have horrendously been misrepresented in psychology, because most psychologists couldn't have cared less, because there were so few of them working in the field and so few trans people. And it's the same with many things. If it's a small niche field, things that were studied from a bias, and from a significantly bad bias, for example, Zucker, tended to stay on the books for a very long time, and that would control the thinking of the other people who are around them, which formed a confirmation bias that made for bad decision making in helping trans people in the past, and in other things. This is, as I said, a problem of science, in that whilst science is self-correcting, that self-correction can take a long time. And in human terms, when you're dealing with psychology, or when you're dealing with medical science, that long time, especially if you're dealing with small sample sizes, can mean people's lives. And that's not a good translation. This isn't necessarily as big a problem in other fields of science, but it has taken us down roads that, have not been good for science. If we go back into the past, before we had germ theory, and people just thought it was smells that made you feel sick, or that bloodletting was good for you, stuff like that. I mean, these were still scientific ideas, granted, most of them pre the scientific method, but they were still they're things of the days. And because there were so few people doing the science, there was so little contingency in science for dealing with this, these things lasted a really long time and hurt a lot of people. And when new ideas came along that shifted those balances, they were pushed back against. Because, oh, this isn't what we've had for 50 years or more. And that still happens in science now. New ideas, whilst if they're outlandish, really need to be checked into and observed and figured out, aren't bad for science. New ideas need to be embraced and looked at because that's how science has always moved forward. Science is a tumbling thing. We don't take giant strides, we tumble and we fall. And sometimes those falls are right into the pit of great ideas, and sometimes they're into a pit of nails. But besides that, yeah, train of thought just went straight out of my brain. I'm going to go through a couple of things that are in the chat at the moment. Yeah, people to personal view beliefs to skew results. Yes, I really wish that wouldn't happen in science. Sam says, I often see paper cited for the sort of conversation around how experiments can be set up. Yep. I can see this is how this is a problem in a lot of areas. Yeah, Krabby, definitely. It is a problem in every area of science. It's more so in some than others, especially when you're talking about psychology, medicine, anything like that. If you're dealing with something that in areas of science where you're dealing with things that can be more subjective, it is an immense problem because it all comes down to the personalities of the people and their personal ideas, and it's really hard to have the scientific backing for that because everything is basically statistical analysis of patients, and statistical analysis of patients is very subjective and is also very easy to manipulate and is often manipulated. I can give you a good example of that. I have one here. In the 1950s and 60s, Sloan Kettering Institute oncologist Chester Southern conducted research into how to learn people's immune systems would react when exposed to cancer cells. So what he did was he got living cancer cells and injected them into cancer patients, which in most of those cancer patients gave them more cancer, as in they had more blastocytes formed, larger amounts of cancers, and involved in the death of several of his patients who probably could have been cured of their cancer. He also then went and used prisoners, as they did back then, who volunteered. Well, I say volunteered, they probably weren't given a lot of choice. He then went and used prisoners and injected cancer cells in them to see if they would get cancer as well, which ended up in the death of at least one prisoner that we know of from cancer because of those experiments. And then, just to follow up, he went back and tested on his cancer patients again. But he was trying to he was trying to figure out if cancer could be transmissible. Which I guess it can if you want to share blood with somebody who's got cancer and the cancer cells are in their blood. It could be. But his way of doing it was in such a way that would not happen in real life and hurt so many people's lives in the process of it that it was completely unethical, completely biased. He fortunately, his co-doctors who were working with him went public on this, resigned from the project, and it ended up losing Southern his tenure where he was working. So yeah, there was. I'm not calling it a happy ending, a just ending to this, but it just remains that people will do whatever they need to get the results that they think they should have. An experiment that comes to mind is the electrocution experiment that the will of peoples experiment that they did, where they wanted to show that this was after the Second World War, and they wanted to find out how the Nazis could get the way that they got, how they could get so much control. So the experiment was, you'd have your subject for the experiment sitting in one room, and they'd have a button to press, and then they would be being ordered by a doctor in lab coat, who actually wasn't a doctor, was an actor, but they didn't know this, to press this button that would cause pain to a person in another room. And the person in the other room wasn't, they were told this person was hooked up to electrodes and stuff like that, and it was just an experiment, on their pain threshold of the other person. Except the experiment was actually about whether people would follow the rules of authority figures. And what they found was that in general, people do follow authority figures. It took a long time and a lot of screaming from the person next door, who, by the way, wasn't actually hooked up to electrodes. They were just acting, for anyone to actually say they wouldn't press the button because they were listening to what the doctor, the person in authority, was telling them. But this is completely unethical, because the people who came out of this experiment were highly distraught by what happened to them, which is similar for most of the soldiers and that who were in the Second World War, who policed the death camps and things like that, because they were distressed by the things that they saw, but they couldn't stop being soldiers. They couldn't stand up to the tyranny that was around them for fear for themselves, or because they were just authority figures who, obviously authority figures, knew better than they did, even at the harm of other people. But these kind of experiments tell social angst within the people who are made to do them. And another example of that, and I actually have this one here, so I'm not going to talk about it off the top of my head. They call it the monster study. And this was Wendell Johnson, who's a speech pathologist. He came up with this wonderful experiment where he used kids, 22 children who were orphans living in a home. He did this experiment on speech pathology with them. What he did was he had half the children were encouraged in their speech and treated nicely, and he wanted to see if that made speech impediments get worse or better. And the other half were criticized for their speech, regardless of if they had a speech impediment or not. This fundamentally stressed these children out of their heads, the ones who are constantly berated for anything that they said. And it did cause speech problems for those kids. It was immoral to do this thing, especially on children. But I will grant that this was in 1939, so there wasn't ethics committees in place at the time to stop people doing these horrible experiments. But it is a problem in science that people will try and get these sort of experiments done because of the greater good. While it's not as big a problem as it once was, because most universities have ethics committees, and ethics committees will sit down and go, hey, you can't do that because you're going to screw people up. Some of these things still get passed. For example, and it was televised, a television show recently did a real life experimental version of the trolley experiment. If anyone who doesn't know the trolley problem, it's you have a train hurtling down a track. It's going to kill 5 people, but if you pull a lever or press a button, the train will stop. It will swap tracks and only kill 1 person. Do you push the button or pull the lever? It's a logical problem. It's a philosophical one too. Is the 5 lives worth more than the 1? Could you actually do this in the situation? That these people wanted to show, if people would follow through and actually what would happen in this real experiment. And they went to 5 different universities to get the backing of a university whose ethical committee would allow them to do this experiment on national television. Um, and to do the experiment, they then had to have the backup of psychologists to calm the people afterwards, a videoing of everything that happened to prove that no one actually died, that they were safe in whatever choices they actually made, and these people were still stressed out of their brain after the experiment was done. And this is just a modern example. This was done about 5 years ago. For the life of me, I cannot remember what the show was. It wasn't Mythbusters. But it was that kind of show where you wanted to look at okay, yeah, Sam, if you ask a Platonist, nothing is worth more than the one. Thank you. But yeah, but basically, ethicists being ethical within science is something that's taken very seriously now. Less so in the past because the ends justified the means. But there are still scientists who think that the ends justify the means, and will still push for it. And if they've got an experiment, they will move between different universities, go somewhere else in the world if they need to find somebody who will let them do an experiment that they consider unethical. I had a discussion about how ethical something was the other day with a group of people when we were discussing uterus transplants, which actually is quite controversial when you really think about it. Whilst it sounds great, oh yes, Sam, sorry, it's Chaos. You don't go by that anymore. I apologize. If you want to hop in, Chaos, feel free. I know I've already given you the link. I'll grab you up and you can join in with me. Yeah. But the discussion we were having the other day about uterus transplants, where I was where we were talking about the efficacy of actually doing uterus transplants, because out of the box, most people would go, "Hey, yeah, that's a good idea." Any woman who's unable to give birth because she's got a problem with the uterus, or a trans woman, or whatever, you can give a uterus transplant to them, and then they can have kids. And then you have to think about the other side of it. And the other side of it is, at the moment, uterus transplants can only be done as live transplants, which means you have to have a donor for the uterus, and the uterus still has to be in decent enough condition. And I'll pop Sam up. Hi, Sam.
That chaos, but hi.
Long time, no chat. Where are we? I bring up the one that's both of us. There we go. But yeah, they when you think about the efficacy of uterus transplants, then you've got to go to the other side of it. Like, it's a live transplant. Live transplants are dangerous to 2 patients, not 1. And then you've got the whole thing of the person who has the transplants now has to take anti-rejection drugs, immunosuppressant drugs, and then they're going to get pregnant whilst they're on immunosuppressant drugs. Now, most women who have transplants who end up on immunosuppressant drugs are suggested not to have children because the drugs can affect the child in the uterus. And yeah, it's not the ideal situation. And yet we're saying that, it's ethical from a point of view of the transplant. Well, yes, it is ethical from the point of view of doing the transplant. We do live transplants for other things. I think there's a reasonable argument to say a live transplant of a uterus is no different than doing live liver transplants or something like that. However, there is the aspect that a live uterus transplant is not life-saving, whereas a live liver transplant is. So if it's not life-saving, is it necessary at that point? Where does the efficacy of the risk with the live transplant come in? But even more so, the fact that the whole point of doing the uterus transplant is for having kids, and it's recommended not to have kids if you're on immunosuppressants, and then the risk that the child will, the extra chance that, there's going to be a lot more miscarriage, there's going to be a lot more stillbirths and things like that. Whilst you're trying to do this, and all that time that person has to be on immunosuppressants who doesn't really need to be on immunosuppressants is a moral question. It's an ethical question, and it's one that is really hard to answer because you've got women out there who want to have kids who can't have their own kids.
I think
And
that as well as
how
it
do you argue it?
being an ethical question, pragmatically, there are very few situations in which I think that it is that a uterus transplant ends up with worthwhile results, so to speak, because every instance I'm aware of, they've ended up having fertility issues anyway and unable to have the child anyway.
No, not true, Sam. There's been there's been there's a particular clinic, and I did link it the other day on Twitter, and I should have had it up here, where they've done 17 transplants, of which there's been 5 successful childbirths from a uterus transplant. So it is actually quite the modern technique for uterus transplants. These are all with cis women, not with trans women, but the modern technique for uterus transplant is quite successful.
I wasn't
Admittedly,
familiar
an
with those 5.
incredibly
I've
small
clearly
sample
just
size. But we already know
I've
the
clearly just seen
risks.
the others then.
Sorry?
Sorry, I said I've just clearly seen the others, but not those 5.
Yeah. Yeah, so when you no 15 successful births.
Oh, okay.
So 15 out of 17 from the institute. There's failures in the other ones, but it's a pretty good ratio. But it's still a really, really tiny sample size, and there's still a lot of failures in that. So you're still going to say, yeah, maybe we've got a 60-70% success rate. Well, you're going to have 30% of child deaths from this. And what about the death of the parents from being on immunosuppressants for prolonged periods of time? That's fine if you're somebody who actually needs a transplant. But you didn't need a transplant. Effectively, a uterus transplant, and I hate to say this, is a want. It's not a need. There are other ways to have kids, and it's perfectly valid to adopt or have surrogacy. That's still valid parenting. A parent is not genetics. You are still a mother or a father, regardless of whether you're genetically related to that child or not. And you cannot be a mother or father even if you are genetically related to a child. So, yeah, it's one of those things that's really hard from an efficacy point of view, from the point of view of actually doing it and producing offspring. I think there's major issues, but from the efficacy point of view of should we do the operation and see if it's successful, I don't necessarily have a problem with the side of actually doing the transplant itself. I mean, aside from the fact that you're putting somebody on immunosuppressants who probably wouldn't have needed them in the first place. But, I mean, we're adults, we can make decisions for ourselves. And if you want to be part of that, as long as it's ethically done and you know the risks, then that's fine. The unethical part to me comes about when you're talking about the life of a child in this situation. Because, whilst while I am pro-choice as far as abortion goes, this is not about abortion. This is about, there's a big risk of miscarriage and loss of this child, and it could be at any point. You also know that there's a big risk that the child that's born might have problems because of the immunosuppressant drugs as well. Is that morally justifiable? Yeah. Sorry, Sam. Chaos. I will fix this in my brain.
Yeah, I expect it'll probably take you a little bit to get into your head because we've not really interacted much for a little while.
Yeah, we haven't interacted for a little bit, but I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here because whilst for most of the scientific fields, you and I are pretty much outsiders looking in with a keen interest and good knowledge. It's a good position to take for looking at something when you've got the knowledge, when you actually research. And by research, I don't mean I've looked at a few web pages. I actually mean I read scientific papers, as I know you do. And I'm
Yeah,
not
well,
doing
that and
research. I
this
am doing
is
study. And study is not
yeah.
research.
This topic happens to be extra relevant to me as a philosophy student, so
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. Because I mean, it is. It's an important part of philosophy. Efficacy. The the efficacy in found in other sciences is a big topic for anybody involved in philosophy, especially if you're talking about philosophy attached to science, which it is because the tenets of
Yeah,
philosophy boil down to how we develop science. So you
and
can't extract one completely from the other.
hence why I mentioned Karl Popper in the chat earlier.
Yeah.
Which I guess possibly now that I've mentioned him out loud, worth explaining that one he's a philosopher, contemporary philosopher, but one of the things that he did was kind of explore the difference between science and pseudoscience. And there's an ethical component to that in terms of like we shouldn't be doing research that we're claiming that it's scientific if it's pseudoscientific and it's not actually falsifiable. We're just using it to back up whatever claim we want to get at.
Yes. Exactly. And this definitely happens as well. There are definitely solid examples of people who've go into science just to prove their concept, and they don't want something that's falsifiable. They just want to be able to say, "Hey, look, it's definitely this." Creation science, I think, is one aspect where you can look at that as a thing that happens.
Yeah, it's why when you look at a paper, not only do you need to look at the structure of the method they used, but also who funded it and what result did they get.
And how they interpreted their result from their data, because it can be very obvious from how the result was interpreted, whether or not the data was stacked, or whether or not their statistical analysis was even remotely accurate. You know, there's a very strong bias in create in creation science things to um, not use proper statistical analysis to get your results. It's very similar to what I was saying before about usually when we do our statistical analysis, we drop off the extremes and then we look at the core set of data. But what you find with studies often done by Christian scientists is they lop off the bit of the study that disagrees with them and they concentrate on this bit.
Yeah, it's like what do you mean other data?
Yeah, other data. Yeah, it's like, yeah, we had other data. Can we see your data set? This is the data set we use. No, I want to see your whole data set. Oh, we got rid of the bit that didn't work. What do you mean didn't work? It didn't back up your preconceived idea. Is that the problem?
Yeah, the thing
I
that
hate to
really
go.
makes me
Sorry,
go
sorry,
on, sorry.
sorry, Case.
I was just gonna say the thing that really makes me bang my head against the wall is when someone goes, "This study says this," and then you look at the study and it doesn't say that at all. Like when people say drinking coffee extends your lifespan, and it was like, no, caffeine injections in mice extended their lifespan. That
Yeah,
doesn't mean
that's
drinking coffee will extend a human's
and
lifespan.
it doesn't mean injecting coffee in humans would extend a human's lifespan either.
No, it's like I guess that just kind of goes to show that there's not only ethical questions around doing the studies, but like
Interpreting
how
the
we
studies.
use, yeah,
Yeah.
interpreting them and how we use them, not just in a is this harmful way, because telling someone that drinking coffee increases their lifespan isn't harmful per se.
Well, it
Like you're
can
not
be. I mean,
like yeah,
if you have
it's
a
not
heart
like you're
condition and you drink an awful lot of coffee, because I've been warned about this,
this is fair.
it actually can be harmful to your health. So
Yeah, like it's not like you're trying to persuade someone of an anti-vax position though or something. Is more I'm trying to get at. in that it's not inherently harmful. It's just there are certainly situations where it could be.
Yeah, but also you could get lack of sleep, and sleep deprivation
Yeah.
isn't good for most people either. So there's
Yeah. There's
there's a
also
lot of aspects to misuse of science. A good example of that is and I'm gonna not remember his name again because I'm really bad with names. Um, but one of the starters of the anti-vax movement, who deliberately misrepresented data on vaccinations so he could start the movement to stop people vaccinating, and then from there it has basically been a roller coaster ride of lies and bullshit. Um, because when you cherry pick like that, you are not representing what the science actually says. And we see this with creationists, we see this with anti-vaxxers, we see this with um, flat earthers, we see this with gender criticals, because these people's concept of science is, well, it's only science if it supports my idea.
yeah. I also this might be better for a little bit later in the stream, but I have a rant about the ethics of willful ignorance that a lot of modern science has.
No, I think that's a great topic to move into now. Actually, I did want to get to that point, so yeah, go for it.
So this is a big issue in science generally. I mean, specifically softer sciences for the example I'm about to use, but sciences in general, kind of this
Yeah.
broader issue can come into where who or what you're getting your data from impacts the results. And sometimes not everything about where the data was gathered from is recognized. So, for example, they
A good
actually took a
example
little
of
while.
that. A good example of that was the study I was talking about earlier about Rog D. Uh, she was a Leah, wasn't she? Um, I can't remember the woman's name. I know she was from Canada.
Yeah,
That's the only bit I remember. But
yeah.
where
But
she collected her data from basically Mumsnet, which so
I
she said,
go on, sorry.
but yeah, so basically she collected her data from the people she knew would give the responses she wanted.
Yeah, but I my preferred example for this sort of thing is the fact that it took so long for it to come out that so much, like almost all of the research done on autistic people
Yes.
was done on young cis white men.
Yeah. Forgetting the cultural differences for presentation of autism, the gender differences for the presentation of autism, and which
Yeah,
led a lot of people from different ethnicities and young women from not being diagnosed as autistic when they should have been because the presentation is different. And it also meant that some cis boys were not diagnosed who should have been because they presented differently too.
yeah, and it's like not only is there a problem with these initial studies not acknowledging their biases, but even
Yeah.
now that their biases have been acknowledged, for example, in the DSM, the new DSM criteria that are kind of rolling out for autism restricts it right back to the things that were found in those studies, effectively meaning that a bunch of people who we know present differently now and
I'm
who
not going to
we
be
know have these
diagnosed.
different factors are either not going to be diagnosed or are going to be misdiagnosed with ADHD because they've broadened the diagnostic criteria for ADHD.
Uh,
And they know this. This has been brought to their attention, but they are willfully ignoring it for
as they
several
do with most
reasons.
things. I mean,
Yeah,
the DSM 5, is it 5 that's next? Yeah, it's 5 that's next. We're on 4 at the moment, and 5's
I think
what's in production. Or is it 6 in production, and we're on 5
I
now?
think I think six is in production, but I'm not certain.
6 is in production, 5's out now. DSM 6 is removing gender dysphoria from as a mental from the as a mental disorder. They're saying it's a byproduct function of how people feel about themselves, and that's generally generated by another condition. So, I think they're stopping labeling gender dysphoria as gender dysphoria as well. They're just calling they're sticking with body dysmorphia for the entire description, because that is a fair statement. Body dysmorphia or body dysphoria is pretty much the same thing, regardless of whether it's a trans person or a cis person that feels it.
Yeah.
In a trans person, it's caused by being trans, but in cisgender people, they have body dysmorphia too, where they're uncomfortable with aspects of their own thing. Now, it used to be a thing that you could train people to not feel that, but in some aspects, you cannot train that out of people because it's how their brains are wired, and it's just not possible.
Something else frustrating.
But that's taken what, 20 years to make those changes. That the psychology is dragged kicking and screaming behind a moving truck. That's how it moves forward. It is one of the biggest problems in psychology, in that it takes so long. When you still have people quoting psychologists from over 100 years ago as if they fucking knew what was going on. And I'm sorry, I finally swore, but it drives you mad because things have moved on so much from there that yeah, it boggles my mind. People shouldn't be quoting Freud anymore.
They shouldn't. I don't get me wrong. They should be teaching Freud when you're taught psychology. Like, this is part of how psychology was formed. Yes, but
yeah, it's the same reason for whilst we taught Newton mechanics as a basis in high school. When you get to college, the concept of teaching Newton should be from a historical perspective, not from a physics perspective, because everything in Newton can be derived from special relativity. So special relativity is the thing that's accurate, and general relativity as well for your motions and stuff. So you can either derive all the equations of Newton either from special relativity or general relativity. One or the other is, depending on whether you need gravity in your equation or not. Yeah.
Is here a good point to bring up the replication crisis, or is that a hold on to it thing?
No. I think we're moving organically, so yep, go for it.
Because something that's kind of very tied to this, but separate, and I am both astounded and frustrated that less people seem to know about this, is the replication crisis, where and you kind of made a reference to part of this earlier, but an astounding amount, massive percentages, to the point that it is a majority in a lot of fields of scientists will or have admitted to either publishing a study that hasn't been checked, or publishing a study with knowingly false information in it, and then none of these studies can be replicated, to the point that a significant chunk of existing scientific information is incorrect, and we just don't always know what it is because we haven't been checking it before it gets published, and papers haven't been checked before they get published in journals, to the point that I think the number is something like 1 in 20 studies is insufficiently.
It is quite high. I remember that. And adjacent to this, one of the things that it kind of falls in the same bracket is where you will have follow-up studies that are deemed as being separate studies done on the same thing, where they've used the exact same data set to confirm the results of the original thing. I'm sorry, if you're going to use the same data set, you're not confirming. You're just repeating. You're just parroting the original. Oh, but we came from it. We're using a slightly different statistical analysis. So what? You use the same data set. You need a new data set so that we actually have a larger pool of data to extrapolate from, especially when you're dealing with studies that might have less than 100 subjects. It is ridiculous to think that this is a completely new study if you have used the same data set. And I've seen people
Yeah.
do this and not be open and honest about it, not up front. And it needs to be up front. It needs to be in the abstract that this is reused data. Because I don't know how many people only use the abstract to determine how a scientific study goes, because you cannot just use the abstract, because there is so much extra information about the study that's in the study itself that can highlight whether there are some of these issues to that study. It's why often people will laud a study when it first comes out, and then you'll find 4 or 5 months later somebody will go and tear it apart because they've actually looked into the detail of what was written in the study, and hey, look, the abstract glossed over all of this.
Yeah,
And
it's
it is
like
a problem.
I think it was a few months ago now. There was something that came out of Cambridge University that was a study that was like, is there evidence that the planet is intelligent? And it's like, just from reading the abstract, you would not know the contents of the paper.
Yeah. Although,
Like
to
you
be
could
fair,
draw
I've
some really
actually
fucking conclusions.
I've read some math papers that don't need an abstract because they're so short. But that's beside the point. If you don't need an abstract, don't use one, because there's not much point. If your paper's less than a page long, and that does happen in maths, you don't need an abstract. You just
Yeah,
you just you
in
just need a short description and then the paper.
in maths, papers can be more like footnotes for other papers in other
Papers, yeah.
subjects.
Maths is very different in this sense. When you have a mathematical proof, all you have to do is demonstrate your proof. You don't have to describe exactly how you got there.
Yeah, here is the start point to the final working. If you disagree, tell me.
Yeah, and that's pretty much maths. Not always. I mean, like for example, you get maths papers on production techniques for deducing numbers, decimal point places of pi, and
Oh
the
yeah,
abstract has to describe the entire programming process and why it works and why it doesn't, and you can end up with quite a long a thing for that. So when you've had statistical analysis in maths like you do in other sciences, then you end up with long papers that have the same issues, because I have seen statistical anomalies in maths papers. People who actually use their own biases in maths to statistically show something that wasn't there, and it's like, huh, you're a maths person. Why are you doing this?
because like how do
I
you even have a bias here?
Yeah, how? Why should? But I mean, there have been biases in maths in the past anyway. I mean, when you're talking about uh, uh, are numbers actual real things that exist somewhere, or are they just concepts we invented?
Oh yeah,
Which is
the
so.
answer to
So, are
which
you
is
a
obviously
Platonist or a? And I can't remember the other dude. Um, about numbers. Because this is a legit argument, and it's a philosophical one had within math,
yeah. The answer
and
to
it's
which
kind
is
of
that
irrelevant.
obviously numbers exist in every capacity except the abstract.
Yeah, I mean the whole thing about it is it's kind of irrelevant. Numbers can represent reality, so regardless of whether we made them up to represent reality or they actually exist as extant things, is irrelevant to the usefulness of it as a tool.
Yeah, that's another thing about some papers is it's like it sounds kind of important, but it's
Yeah,
really not.
really not. Yeah, yeah, and we do get a lot of this, and it frustrates me. And the general public, we do a lot, and I mean, you and I both know this. There's a lot of arguments to be had with people whose understanding of science fails before what you'd have in the UK of GCSE, or we'd have as a high school graduation. They fail at science before then. So they don't even have a high school level of scientific understanding, and they think they know what they're talking about. And you end up with arguments with these people, which are kind of pointless because they're never going to understand what you're talking about anyway, because they don't have the grounding
Yeah.
to understand it. And they basically end up asking you to explain how how you got to your conclusion, which would require a science degree in the first place.
Yeah,
Because
like
because
if they at least had a basic grasp of how scientific terms work, that would make our jobs a whole lot easier. Thanks.
yeah, it would. But it's not even that. It's the fact that for people like that, the abstract is all that matters. Um, and
Yeah.
then it comes down to the same aspects of like you get with creationists cherry picking Charles Darwin. Um, if you're going to take something out of the context, then the context has to be the entire paper, not just the abstract, not just the sentence written within the middle of the paper. The context has to be the entire paper. If you're going to take
Yeah.
something out of the context of that paper, then I'm not listening to you anymore, because it's pointless to argue with somebody who wants to do that, because you may have completely missed the point. And when I quote a section of a paper, I will link the paper so you can go and read the whole frickin' paper. If you're linking of a paper, people get frustrated with me. Like, I will link papers. I don't even usually post the section out of a paper if I'm referring to something. I'll just link the entire paper. And then they'll go, I'm not reading all of that. And I'm like, well, if you're not going to read all of that, then you obviously don't understand it in the first place.
Or
Because
you don't
I
care
have read that. So I will. Here's an article explaining about that. But you can go back. But if you really want to understand it, go back and read the scientific paper. Because the article's going to get shit wrong as well, because they usually do. Most scientific journalists don't have a science degree. They are journalists first.
I have strong opinions on that, but I feel like we'd be here too long discussing that one point, so I'm going to leave it.
I did say most. Some are actual scientists. I mean, when you have somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson being journalistic in their approach of teaching science, they are a genuine science, and when they're doing their journalistic side of things, they're being a journalist. Oh, yeah. They are a legitimate scientist. He also doesn't talk about things outside of his field with authority.
Or when he does, he invariably messes up, so you know not to listen.
Yeah, you know not to believe him. Yeah, but even then, he'll usually preface it with something like, "This isn't my field," but which is how I normally prefacing all of this with, most of these scientific areas are not my field. I'm a mathematician. I am not a physicist. I am not a biologist. But I do know how scientific papers work, and I do know how to read them, and I do know when people are talking absolute gobshite.
If it isn't couched in at least between like 1 and 4 disclaimers, it isn't coming from a scientist.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where people don't understand peer review either, because the whole concept of peer review is that the person doing the review of the paper is trying to find out if it's where it's wrong. That is the point of doing a peer review, is to confirm a paper, we need to show that we didn't find anything wrong with it, is basically how science works. So it's not like, that looks really good, we think that's cool. If we peer review something, we're trying to pull that original paper, that original study apart, find everything that's wrong with it, and find out if that could destabilizes the paper enough that it can no longer be trusted as a source of information. And that is how we peer review things. If we can't do that to a paper, it will continue to stand. And it will continue to stand until somebody tears that paper down. So for something like general relativity and special relativity, they've stood for over 100 years. But a lot of papers do not. For example, the one I mentioned about Zucker stood for 10 years. That's it. It is gone. We know that he skewed his results. He lost tenure. He lost his position. He is
Yeah.
considered disgraced by most of the field now. Certainly, he's not considered disgraced by people who want to shit on trans people, but he's considered disgraced by most of the rest of his field.
Time
and
is
yeah,
time
yeah,
frames are also weird in science because you can say, "Oh, this thing came out last year. That's like an old paper now," and you can also
yeah,
say, "Oh, this paper only came out 150 years ago. It's relatively recent." And
yeah,
both of those are using the same framing of them being scientific papers, and both of those are perfectly reasonable responses.
yeah. Because in science we don't grade a paper on how old it is. We we grade a paper on how well it has stood up to scrutiny. So a paper that is 100 years old that has stood up to scrutiny time and time again, has had experiments to reconfirm it time and time again, will be held in high esteem. Not because it's 100 years old, but because it has stood up to the tests of science. The same can be said for a paper that's 5 years old, if at that amount of time it has stood up to the tests. If they don't stand up to the tests, I don't care if they're 2 weeks old or 100 years old, they are not considered the science anymore.
Yeah. If they don't pass those tests, they just go into the realm of pop science.
Yeah.
Which another thing that I would like to smack my head against the wall over is
Yep.
the amount of quote unquote pop psychology that goes around.
Pub psychology. Yes. Well, I hate to go back to it, but it's only because I've been fighting on Twitter ever since Leah Thomas. But the pub psychology that and pub biology that has surrounded Leah Thomas since her wins in women's sport has driven me absolutely freaking bonkers. I I don't mind people having and I don't like the term genuine concerns, but there there are reasonable concerns in this, which is why there are rules for trans participation in sports. What I mind is people blatantly going off half cock, not knowing what they're talking about, and complaining bitterly, and thinking that the sports scientists who make these decisions don't actually read the fucking papers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the opinion that the whole gendered separation in sports is dumb. But if we're going to have it, at least look at what the data says,
Yeah,
please.
I'm kind of with you on that. I think if your argument, first up, the arguments are ridiculous. If your argument is that it makes sport fair, then you obviously don't watch fucking sport because there is nothing fair in sport. If you wanted to make sport fair, you would get rid of divisions between all divisions that we currently have. We'd get rid of all the divisions we currently have. We'd introduce handicaps so that everyone could compete against anyone, but they have a handicap. If you're all about safety, then there should be weight divisions in every sport. For example, a team of soccer players should all be the same size so there's less chance that anyone's going to hurt anyone else. If you're going to say that a trans woman playing with women is a danger physically to other people, then you have to remove any cis women who could be that same physical danger. Or else you actually don't care about safety in sports. All you care about is your bigotry. And this is a problem with people's interpretation of things and wanting to say things that it's an entirely different discussion to the one we're having, though, so I will get off it.
Yeah. I feel like the relevant link though to the conversation we're having is that the access that we have to scientific papers without having access to an expert explaining it, I think is actually kind of a harmful thing that's resulted in a bunch of misuse of it.
I
Partially
agree.
because of a bit of an ivory tower thing, and partially because of a people willfully choosing not to look because they want it to say this.
Well, it's the
And
two
that's a moral
aspect
issue on
sides of
both
it,
sides of
isn't
the
it?
coin.
It's like, I'm a bigot. I think trans women are men, so therefore I will choose scientific data which says that men perform better in these sports than women do. And then you tell these people, well, hang on, we have scientific data of trans women competing with cis women, and the changes in physical strength and capabilities of trans women. They go, that doesn't matter. They're men. Then you've missed your fucking boat. And this is a problem of not understanding how the science works, how categories work, how we do all this. And it just comes down to, at that point, willful ignorance and or bigotry, because they often walk hand in hand.
Yeah,
Generally,
I think that
generally willful ignorance creates bigotry.
yeah, I think that besides the whole like willfully either misrepresenting or putting forward papers that they know haven't been checked or whatever, one of
Yeah.
the biggest like modern unethical things that a lot of scientists do is the whole ivory tower of explicitly creating their content in a way that it is not accessible to lay people in any form.
They're
Because
like
there are some
lawyers,
papers
aren't
that you
they?
just can't. Yeah, they really are, and it's like there are not every paper, obviously, but with a
No.
decent chunk of papers at the very least. If you try and find explanations that like break it down for you, a lot of the explanations get like copyright attacked, almost like a slap suit. And it's like it starts to feel like they're actively trying to keep knowledge from other people.
Yeah. It's like I've had discussions with people where they're going, what does the P mean when when they're talking about the statistical data in a scientific paper? And I'm like, yeah, because most people don't understand how statistics is done. And the P represents a variance that you can have before the data becomes unreliable. Um, that's probably an oversimplified way of describing what P is, but so you have to have P within a certain range to say that the data is statistically viable. Um, so if you have too much variance in your data set is not going to be useful. Um,
Yeah, there's I feel like as we're kind of talking about this, it almost feels like we're starting to look at each step of the scientific process and
it
we're
does
just
feel like
going
that, doesn't it? And we've moved
and we're
away
just
from
going, here's what
morals and ethics um, and efficacy.
ethics.
So
Yeah.
but this is
It's
part of it.
it's
Part of the
all
problem, it's all interrelated, and it is all part of the problem of science. That image that comes out to the general public, where the general public won't understand, even if a scientific paper is good, often those scientific papers will be misrepresented in public because people don't understand them or how we get to those decisions. And then we have the problem of the fact that um, a lot of, and as Chaos was saying, it can be as much as 1 in 20 papers have underlying issues with them of either false bias within the study itself, miscalculations. There are so many different problems that can come out in papers and do all the time that make those papers not viable for use in science, and it is a major problem. It is a problem in science itself, and if we don't admit it, if we don't address it, it's going to get worse because humans naturally have biases, and humans naturally tend to skip over things. If we have a if we have a position we want to get to in something, and our mathematical analysis shows it to be a certain way because we wrote this algorithm and ran it on the computer and stuff like that, and we get to a result we want, we generally stop there because we're humans. We don't go back and double check our algorithm or our data sets or anything like that. We got the result we wanted, and it's how we
yeah,
work as
and
humans. Yep, go on.
you said a minute ago that this sort of thing doesn't tie into like or isn't directly morality, but it is all tied
Mm.
together. But I think in a way it actually is because if you consider these steps of the process and the way people do them wrong as individual moral or immoral acts, if they are willfully choosing to do it in an incorrect way, if you look at it
Yeah,
ideologically, they are doing their job wrong and producing incorrect information for the collective information that humanity has. But even if you look at it from a
yeah.
pragmatic standpoint, there's a plethora of evidence
I
that
love that word.
incorrect science the incorrect understandings of scientific information or incorrect interpretations of data in science leads directly to harm. Like we have
Yeah,
a ton of different studies where when people either didn't understand them or the study was done wrong, it directly led to harm.
yeah,
So it can in fact be really immoral to not like be very explicit about your biases or about what happened with the data.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I honestly think that's one of the steps forward for us in science is we should be listing our biases as part of our studies. I mean, for example, if you or I did a study about trans people or intersex people or anything like that, we should be listing our medical and histories, etc., as part of our biases towards that study, so people know, and that's the way it should be. Things about our own histories, things about how we view things should be listed as part of the biases that could affect our papers. I mean, we do see this in some papers. There have been, I know I mentioned the neutrino experiment earlier, but they, because it was such a outlandish result that they got, they actually listed the things that they thought could have been the cause, what they'd actually ruled out, and actually actively asked for other people to look for causes that they'd missed. So it was very much a case of they really thought that they would be shown to be wrong because they didn't believe this could possibly be true, and it wasn't. So there are people who you can have studies that end up with bad results for reasons, but people realize that those results are wrong. Um, this will more often happen in something like physics, where there's a lot of preconceived ideas in physics about how things should be, and that's because of years and years of study and theories that actually have stood the test of time and other studies. So that if you find something that contradicts a whole heap of other studies that supported something, it's probably your study that's wrong and not the other ones. So there are definitely cases where preconceived ideas have strong merit, but that's as far as I would go, is saying that they've got strong merit. It's a bit different when you're talking about, as you said, softer sciences like psychology, or sociology or anything like that, where you've got issues of everything is incredibly interpretive, and uh, and as such,
Psychology is still a
um,
new field.
yeah, psychology is still a new field. So everything is still very interpretive, more so than physically measurable. So as soon as you're moving into sciences where things are more interpretive than the hard set data, then you're dealing with people. So you're dealing with people's opinions and what people are giving you as feedback. Even medicine to a degree is like this. There are some form of pain that you'll the only acknowledgement you have for the fact that a person has that pain is that they're telling you that they have pain. And, if somebody has a broken arm, yeah, scientifically you can show that they're probably going to have pain with that. But the level of pain and where that pain is purely subjective on the person. So even in medicine, things can be subjective instead of objective. And we have to be aware of this in any field of science, in any papers that are written, that things are often subjective and not objective. And the sooner something becomes the more subjective something becomes, the more personal bias will enter into it.
Yeah, very much so. I there's the it feels sort of connected to personal bias, but sort of disconnected. The thing about like bad philosophy in scientific papers, can is a bit of a pet peeve that while I think it ties into the moral issues that we've been discussing, only in so much as like someone incorrectly using a methodology,
Yeah.
like when someone dismisses out of hand personal testimony as a data point for gathering information in a soft science and therefore dismisses soft sciences,
Yeah.
that is a misunderstanding of the philosophy behind science that is
Yeah.
also harmful. And part of the reason why that I try and bring up if someone asks me why does philosophy even matter in the first place is if you were not willing to take other people's words for it for things,
Yeah.
then A, how do you do any study in relation to people ever?
How do you
Even
get along
about
with your life in general if you're not
yeah,
willing to take other people's word on things?
but but not even that. You effectively then eliminate all of the scientific studies because they could be lying.
And they have been shown to at times.
Yeah, and so it just while we're kind of on the same general topic, that's just another frustration about like a thing that people do sometimes willfully incorrectly in relation to the scientific method is just
Mm.
straight up discard bits of it because they don't think it works, even though they've not looked into why it works. And
Yeah.
I've seen like people who write papers do this.
Yeah. Krabby has said, especially in medicine, in my less than humble opinion, that yeah, this is a problem. Well, yeah, in medicine and psychology and all those sort of human sciences, you have this problem because you're dealing with
Yeah.
human beings, um, and relying on a chart of different faces to relay the amount of pain is woefully inadequate. I agree, but it's one way that you can get an idea from people of how much pain they're in. Um, it's not particularly accurate. We don't have a painometer that is accurate for everybody, and everybody experiences pain differently, and everyone has different pain thresholds. So
Yeah.
someone's 5 might be somebody else's 10 on the scale, and that's the problem you have. Also, if you have chronic pain where you're experiencing pain all the time, your level of pain threshold increases to cope with the fact that you've got chronic pain. So your level of pain that
Can
you're
confirm.
describing as a 5 would probably be what somebody else would call an 8 or 9 anyway, just because you've had chronic pain, because you're always living with that pain.
Yeah, I mean, I experience chronic pain, and when I look at the descriptors of kind of the 1 to 10 scale, like on a good day, I'm at a 3 normally. But also, when I describe the physical pain to other people, they're like, "How does that not constantly distract you from everything?"
Because we get used to it.
Because your body adjusts, I guess.
Yeah,
Like on the one
my
hand,
constant
fuck the
background
human
pain is
body's
probably about the
design.
same as yours. So I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't affect me because I am used to it. I have built a level of pain tolerance that says this isn't pain. If I have pain above that, it would be normally what people have as a 5 or a 6. And it's hard to gauge that anymore once you're experiencing levels of pain all the time.
Though ironically, I'm still a little bit of a wuss. Like I will complain for like half an hour about a paper cut, even though it doesn't really hurt after the first couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'm like Krabby. I try not to take my pain meds if I don't have to. I would rather allow my natural um, tolerance to pain to increase than
I
actually take the pain meds.
I take pain meds in evenings because I like sleep.
Yeah, I've done that at times when my back's particularly bad. I will just take pain meds and go to sleep. But outside of that, generally in the day, if you've got a constant amount of X amount of pain happening, it's just like a dull buzz that exists behind you, and your brain eventually filters it out. You know it's there, but it's not impeding in your ability to do other things. The difference does come down when you've got constant pain and you're trying to sleep, because when you're trying to go to sleep, that's when you become aware of the pain that's there.
Yeah, it's like, oh, I've stopped for the day, and ow, my back is on fire.
Yeah, pretty much. Or, oh god, I can't move now. How did I move all day?
It's a nightmare.
Yeah. I shouldn't really complain. Not when my brother's over in the other room with chronic liver failure, and his constant background pain is about a 5. So I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to complain about mine.
Yeah,
But
I,
it is
I think we still get to complain. We just don't get to complain in the face of his.
Yeah, we get to complain to people who have no pain, and we get to commiserate.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's we have gone way off track now. I think we've covered most of the points that I wanted to cover.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the only bit of the process we haven't really covered, at least a bit extensively, is when experiments are just the process of the experiment leads to some results that are
Erroneous
I'm trying to think how to
or
word. I'm trying to think how
unethical.
to word this. I'm trying to think how to word this now. Like if you describe the process to someone, that isn't in and of itself unethical, but the results aren't in and of themselves unethical results. But there's somewhere in the middle that kind of is. And the example I would go to for this is the Stanford marshmallow experiment, because they found with a lot of the data was that the way they'd framed the whole experiment in the first place was an experiment in relation to children's ability to think, like have delayed gratification.
Okay, yeah.
And so the idea of the experiment, for anyone who doesn't know the name of it offhand, is just you sit a kid in front of a marshmallow, tell them, "I'll be back in a bit. Don't eat the marshmallow, and if you don't, you get a second when I come back." And you kind
And
of
how many of the
they
kids
thought,
eat the marshmallow
yeah, and they
and then
found
lie about
typically,
it?
oh yeah, but it's like they found that typically, kids who were like lower class tended, and this is kind of a classist thing, where they said that it lower class kids didn't have as good long term ability, ability to like wait for pleasure later. But that was like later studies have found that that's not the case, and so their framing of the experiment was entirely wrong. And the results they got out were kind of racist, because the way that the classes worked in how the experiments were done, there were way more people of color in the lower classes than the higher classes
Yeah.
in terms of their data. And so it's like the data that they got out could, in theory, be interesting. And if you describe the methodology of the experiment itself, there's nothing wrong. But the lens through which they did the experiment in the first place got them a completely ridiculous conclusion.
They were looking for a result and they got it. It was pretty
Yeah,
much.
and I'm not sure what step of the way to describe that as, but that's also an issue that sometimes comes up, where it's not even like they intentionally messed this one up. They just, when they were creating the experiment, genuinely framed it in a way that they didn't even notice they were asking the complete wrong question.
Yeah. And this unfortunately happens a lot. I mean, in this particular case, there are a lot of different reasons why different kids would not take it, and they concentrated in on one particular reason and found the results they wanted. Is pretty much the way the experiment went.
Yeah, still more ethical than the
Where
Stanford prison, though.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, a lot more ethical. This is more ethical than the experiment on speech pathologies with kids as well. So
Yeah.
I that and I mean this reminds me too of the experiment they did with the red and the blue, um, where they used high school kids and they basically over a weekend and they basically said that the blues were always in charge and the reds are the underdogs and basically the slaves of the blues, and they made this act out, and within 2 days there was violence and people injured and they had to call off the entire experiment because you can't do these kind of experiments because people follow authority figures or rebel against them. And if you deliberately hand a position of authority into people, especially kids, it's going to get abused and you're going to find a retaliation from the side that you're going to say is going to have to be the abused. So you can't create a situation like that with actual human beings because we are actually human beings, um, with all the baggage that comes along with that. And I can't even remember where that experiment was done, but I know it was bloody dreadful. I think there were 3 kids hospitalized after it, which is not what you want from an experiment.
I I do recall that experiment, but the details on that are so fuzzy to me. I'm not going to be able to help with that either.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I've read a lot of these things in the past and I don't remember them in detail. Uh, but it is all part of that efficacy thing and where we're looking at with it. And so, so yeah, it's yeah. There's all these aspects of morality and efficacy that in science is often abused. Not. I'm not saying it's always deliberate. It isn't always deliberate. There has been done deliberately, um, and that honesty there in the scientific method is sadly lacking for a lot of researchers, where they have preconceived ideas. They want to get the results they had, so they feed their data. I hate to go back to Zucker again, but I mean Zucker cherry picked the kids he wanted in his experiment on desistance. And not only that, he claimed that kids who were gender non-conforming, and I don't know why I did that in quotes. He claimed, his claim was the thing in quotes, gender non-conforming were trans, and there is a difference between being gender non-conforming and being trans. You can be gender non-conforming and not be trans, and you know that is the
Yeah,
thing. But anyone who showed any signs of anything that was gender non-conforming was open slather for his experiment, and he cherry picked those. And when you're talking about a man who professed conversion therapy, so he was forcibly doing conversion therapy on these same kids who were in his study, and he wonders why and then he cherry picks away the statistics that are done in the study, and people didn't query why he got an 86% desistance rate? Of course he did. But even that aside, half of the people, nearly half, 44% of the 126 subjects he used for this study pulled out of the study, and no follow up was done on them. And his assumption in his statistics was all those who pulled out desisted. Not that these people didn't like being pushed through conversion therapy and went somewhere else, which was a lot of the cases because follow up studies did check up on these people. Um, it was that they desisted because they stopped seeing him. So he was completely biased in what he presented. And I'm singling him out because I read and argued a lot about him in the last couple of weeks. But he's not alone. This thing in psychology and medicine and social sciences happens all the time, and it happens to a lesser degree even in physics and chemistry. Well, probably a little less so in chemistry because um, an advantage for chemistry is very simple to check to see if your chemical analysis was actually right in the first place. It's a lot easier to do some of those experiments than some of the physics ones. Um, but it still happens in these more core fields of science, in these STEM areas. It still happens in STEM areas. It's just more prevalent in medicine and psychology and social sciences because you're dealing with human beings and you're dealing with opinions. Because effectively, a hypothesis in these cases is opinions. They're just, hey, I thought up this idea. Let's go test it. Let's do some surveys. Let's get a whole heap of people. Let's study these people and rely on their feedback and then my statistical analysis of their feedback. And let's not. One thing we haven't talked about: rigged questionnaires.
Oh,
The
yes.
structure of the questions given to the patients can incredibly invoke bias within the study. We know that statistics can be manipulated by questionnaires because politicians do it all the time. And a lot, well, not a lot, a decent number of people who work in the softer sciences will stack their questions to get the answers they want. And it's a bad reflection on science that they all fall in that 1 in 20 where we're talking about bad papers and bad science. But 1 in 20,
that's still 5%.
is it's still 5%. And if you're talking about a 5% failure rate of doing science properly in science, and remember that 1 in 20 is across all science, it'll be worse for things like medicine and psychology and sociology. And the further away you get from empirical evidence, the more prevalent this is in science. And it is a problem. And it is a problem that anyone in the scientific field is going to have to face. Anyone trying to read through all the mountains of scientific information out there when you're talking about a subject with people, you are going to face this. What is true and what isn't. And it's why we don't often talk about truth in science. We talk about weight of evidence. And if you're going to take a paper, or a singular paper on itself, as being a weight of evidence, don't. Never take a single paper as a weight of evidence. Look for the corroborating evidence from other people. Look at a time frame of supporting evidence for what's been presented. If this is a brand new paper, take it with a grain of salt. Say, hey, this is really interesting, but it's new. We need follow-ups and we need to know what's happening. If it's an older paper, look to see if it's been supported by subsequent papers, and not just papers that used exactly the same data set. People who actually redid the experiments or properly went into it. And if you find a whole heap of things where people have actually gone and torn this study apart and shown why it's not accurate, maybe don't use that original study because it's probably not very trustworthy. Look for the bigger picture in this, in that science isn't about one particular study. It never is. In physics, somebody does a small study, gets a result, and if that's the result can lead to something more positive in physics, a furthering of our knowledge. It's not that, oh, this is our furthering of knowledge. It's, oh, here's something we need to spend more money on and study further. And it isn't till years later. The Higgs boson is a great example of this. Papers written on it, and then over years and years we do more and more experiments to try and confirm it. And then it took 2 separate experiments, granted both done at the at the same collider. And I got a mental blank about what the Large Hadron Collider. Why did I get a mental blank about that? Weird.
I don't know.
I
wasn't sure if you needed me to fill that in or if you just needed a second.
I was hoping you'd fill it in because I was feeling really stupid for a second. Even though both the experiments were done at the Large Hadron Collider, they were done in a significantly different way. They both we're able to confirm the existence of the Higgs boson. It's not a theorized particle, a particle which had a lot of grounding work done in it in earlier super colliders. Um, Excuse my mouth for speaking before my brain is active. Um, uh, uh, but in the end, we get confirming results. So 2 results that confirm this, and then subsequent results at the Large Hadron Collider. And I will hazard a guess be completely confirmed again in future experiments at even bigger or more efficient colliders. We have some good technologies for actually making smaller colliders that are just as powerful as the LHC in the future, which means we can actually go back to making smaller colliders that can do what the LHC does, which will be cheaper to rerun the experiments and get confirming results, which is great. But it takes that. It takes time. Science takes time, and science requires confirmation, and confirmation is statistical. So everything in science, there's not a whilst there are facts in like force equals mass times acceleration is a fact, because we've defined it. So when we define things within mass, we have facts, and we end up with facts because they are facts. But when we're talking about the fundamentals of how things work, we're talking about theories, and theories, whilst elevated to higher status than facts, are falsifiable. They could be wrong because it's only what our current knowledge is of the universe. It's unlikely that you're ever going to find that something like special relativity or general relativity is wrong. We might find that our interpretation of it is wrong, or that it's not complete, which is most likely in the case of just special relativity and general relativity, that they're not complete theories and there'll be something more to add to it in the future. They won't be wrong. In the same way that Newton wasn't wrong, he was just a small fraction of what you get out of general relativity and special relativity. He was looking at he was looking at it through a viewfinder that only gave him a certain amount of the picture, and it took us to have more of the picture to get more of the information. So science evolves in that sense. So to take one paper and say this paper represents the fact of everything is just wrong if you're going to quote a paper. And be prepared if you do that for somebody to throw something back at you which just disputes what you've said based on that paper, because I've had it done to me several times. And then I've had to go back through and read what was sent back to me and point out that, hey, you might have disproved part of what was in that, but your paper actually supports the bit I was talking about. Or I've had to concede and say, I didn't know about this, I was wrong. Usually it's the former. Usually it's the case that the bit I was talking about I was actually right about, but not always. I've been wrong. I'm often wrong. I like being wrong because then I learn something.
Yeah. If I'm wrong, I can fix it.
Yeah, if I'm wrong, I can fix it. I can fix that. I can fix being wrong. Wrong is perfectly fine, but wrong is a perfectly valid position to be in, as long as you admit that you're wrong and you learn from it and you try not to be wrong again about that same thing. So that's the thing. We learn from it. We expand our ideas based on this. So yeah, and really we've gone full circle. We've gone back to where we as consumers of the science should be looking for what is right in the science that we see, that we consume. Sorry. Sorry, Chaos. I thought you were going to add something there.
Oh no. My internal thoughts there were just kind of, well, I guess we've been through the whole process, but still, fuck the Stanford prison experiment in particular.
I can think of fuck a lot of them in particular, to be quite frank.
Yeah, it's especially in psychology. There's a long list, especially Maslow. Like, uh,
Psychology is dreadful for, but even in medicine, the doctor who had this great idea that men aging was purely because of lowering testosterone. So he was harvesting testicles originally from prisoners who were executed, and then later on from animals that he was initially basically inject um, transplanting the testicles into these older prisoners, which of course killed some of them because of rejection, to try and prove his point. And later on, he was grounding up testicles and injecting it into their abdomens.
see, this particular one I haven't heard of, but I think I've heard of, if you know what I mean. Like,
Yeah,
I
it's one
haven't
of
looked at
those
it myself, but
odd weird things, but it's the things that happened. I mean, there's often this shock and thing of what the Nazis did for medical experimentations during the Second World War, and I hate to bring up Nazis again because don't we all hate Nazis? Um, but the same type of medical experiments were being done in the UK and the US and anywhere else because the efficacy wasn't there. We didn't have ethical tribunals that decided whether these things were right or wrong to do. And as I've said now, people get around those ethical tribunals because they they go and find somewhere else that will let them do it. You have scientists in America who will go as far as to joining universities in China because that particular university has a low level of moral objection to things, just so they can do an unethical experiment. And this happens. You know, people will cross borders to do their unethical experiment, even though they've been told time and time again, this is not ethical. You are going to hurt people. But they will still do it because their need for that is greater than their want to protect humanity. um, it's
yeah,
one of
that
those
their
things where
own
science,
personal ego.
yeah, their own personal ego. Science should not be driven by egos ever. Unfortunately, it is because the people who tend to rise to the top tend to be the people with the biggest egos. Not always, but it does happen. Um,
Yeah, the
look
the
at
the only
look at.
situation. Go on, sorry.
I was going to say, look at some of the people who are top end science communicators whose egos, you, yeah, you couldn't fit them in a truck. You know,
Yeah, the only situation in which ego should be a large component of a scientific study is when you're talking about the psychological term ego, preferably in
yeah,
relation to personality disorders.
that would be an interesting study to do. Um the studying the egos of people within the scientific community. Yeah, that wouldn't be controversial at all.
No, I'm sure
I
every
couldn't think of.
psychologist would just jump at the chance.
Yeah. And the person with the biggest ego does the study. That way they can leave themselves out of it.
Yeah,
It's dreadful.
the observers were not measured in order to
True.
reduce bias.
To reduce their bias, we had volume knobs installed and turned them down. Audio joke. um, yeah. I think we've probably come to the end of this conversation.
Probably,
I
yeah,
think we've
unless we
covered
just want to
almost
crack
everything.
jokes about like unless we want to crack jokes about specific studies all evening, I think we're probably about done.
Yeah, I think we're about done. There's lots of these things you can look up online. There are various lists of bad studies that broke ethics in all scientific fields. Um, most of them will end up coming out of psychology and medicine, unfortunately. But that is the nature of the beast. Um, but you do find them in physics and in chemistry as well. Where
Yeah. They're just less dramatic.
they're just less dramatic, yeah. Generally, they don't involve hurting people, although they have done. um, I mean, we could argue the ethics of the Manhattan Project.
This is true.
um, so yeah, there are certain times in history where we've done certain things that have definitely been not ethical in science, and it still happens to this day. There's still people who fudge their results. There are still people who selectively choose their subjects to make sure that they fit their preconceived ideas, and there are still people who just outright lie. And this is all part of that 5% problem in science. And 5% is not a small amount. There, there are, statistically, there are more fudged results in scientific papers than there are trans people on the planet. Statistically,
Yeah,
in comparison to the.
oh yeah, and the comparison that I always make to this when I'm talking to like tabletop gamers or whoever is literally just it's exactly the same as saying, "Oh, you're never going to roll a 1 playing D&D." You don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's 1 in 20. So yeah. But yeah, thank you, Chaos, for joining me. As always, it was an absolute pleasure, and your psychology um take on it was psychology. Yeah, yeah. Philosophy take on it was very
Philosophy,
important,
yeah.
and the psychology side of it, but definitely the philosophy side of it. My brain is just screwing up words at the moment.
Oh, good.
Um,
Well, definitely thanks for having me
Nothing
on.
unusual. No, it's been good to be on a stream with you again. And thank
Yeah.
you to everyone in the chat who's been wonderful, and to anybody who's watching this later. And expect some more content out of me more regularly again. I think my 3-month break has been more than enough, and I'm looking forward to getting back more into doing science content and language content. Although you'd think I'd fail at language content with the way that my mouth hasn't wanted to say the words I've wanted to tonight. So yeah, there's been that. But I do plan on doing some language content. I'm also going to be doing a project about what it means to be a man or a woman. That's going to be a long-term one where I'll have different guests on, and we'll be discussing that from both a biological and a sociological perspective. So that should be interesting. What have you got coming up, Chaos?
What I've got coming up is hopefully eventually fixing my laptop so I can actually make videos again. And because I'm presently on an accidental hiatus due to technical issues, but I am still around. I might be around here a bit more again now that you're back. We'll see if I'm awake at the correct times.
Oh yeah.
I'm trying to be around on Neil 604's channel a bit. I'm around on One Ring 42's channel. I'd say most
for
weeks these
Medium
days.
Musings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I'm around a bit. I'm on Twitter. I'm in the process of fixing my link tree because all of my links have changed, but I keep getting distracted.
Yeah.
So not an
I
awful lot coming out from me right now, other than that I do have plans eventually.
well, I'm be more than happy to do more stuff with you. It's always fun talking science with you. Hopefully next time I do one of these, Matt will be around as well, and we can have a bit of a three-way discussion about some science stuff.
That'd
He
be
is
cool.
pretty busy with university at the moment. But yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to you again. Looking forward to everyone in the chat again, and we will catch you on the next one. Bye.